because it's such a small group tonight, I think we will spend more time on questions than we usually would. So please be prepared to participate. Help me to respond to this big question. So I wanted to speak about the end of conflict because there seems to be so much conflict in the world today. So it seemed to be an obvious topic. Of course, I have no solutions to the problems of the world. I have no solutions to the problems that we're all facing at this point, but sometimes when we can't solve problems in any kind of practical, hands-on way in the real world, it's good to kind of stand back and look at the human predicament from larger philosophical and metaphysical perspectives, to give one a sense of a bigger sense of context for the challenge of the human predicament. So that's what I want to try and do in a short talk, because what makes us feel suffocated often in life is when we're too close to a problem. We're too close to a problem or something that's really troubling us or bothering us or causing us to experience anxiety or fear or confusion or anger. We're too close to it. We can't see beyond it. And the practice of philosophical inquiry and metaphysical aspirations is to see beyond particular relative issues and break through to a big and vast and open, spacious context that includes everything, but includes everything, and at the same time transcends everything at the same time. And in that we find a source of liberation and spiritual and existential release and relief. So we realize that even if we can't come to terms with the problem that we're facing, we can't solve it immediately, the world's not going to necessarily come to an end. Even though ours might. Anyway. So the end of conflict, or the aspiration for the end of conflict, is to come to the end of conflict is a spiritual aspiration. The famous psychologist Jack Engler told me once that he felt that most of the most serious seekers after enlightenment are individuals who have suffered a lot and want to come to the end of suffering or conflict within themselves. So often what makes us seek earnestly to come to the end of suffering is pain and suffering, too much of it. And of course, the ultimate discovery of the end of suffering is to awaken to the ground of being, or the ultimate non-dual ground of the totality of reality. That's when we realize, in a burst of insight or awakened consciousness, that everything that exists is part of everything else that exists. Nothing is separate. We're all part of one cosmic process that has no beginning and no end. It seems to be eternal. And it's this mysterious recognition of non-duality, or what they call in Tibetan Buddhism, dependent origination, which means that everything that exists depends upon everything else that exists. When we realize in a flash of insight that this whole process is completely integrated, and we can't get outside of it or away from it, no matter where we go, because it is everywhere, and we are part of that, that process, which is completely undivided and completely integrated. And this recognition compels us to stop pushing away reality and to stop seeing life in pieces or reality in pieces, but we begin to have a sense of the whole of the totality of reality as a touchdown, as a foundational existential and experiential reference point in our relationship to our own moment-to-moment experience. And this changes everything. What causes us to suffer so much unnecessarily is the seeing reality from partial perspectives. And it's when we push away a lot of things that we either don't want to see or can't see. And this creates pain and suffering. So when we stop seeing division, especially metaphysically, we see everything in the context of the totality of everything that exists. And the fundamental feeling, the fundamental feeling vibration of the totality of everything that exists and everything that doesn't exist is peace. So what does the sum totality of reality feel like? Sum totality of everything that exists and everything that does not exist feels like peace. It feels free and peaceful and inclusive. It's the opposite of when we're seeing reality as a bunch of parts, some of which we think belong and some others that don't belong. So the end of conflict is the end of duality. And the end of conflict and the end of duality is is a visionary experience. It's a feeling experience. It's a metaphysical revelation. It's when we have that kind of experience, we really feel we are touching the ground of reality in a way that is different than other kinds of experiences, because in this kind of experience we transition from relative or partial perspectives to a non-relative or absolute context in which, as I've been saying, everything is included. And that always is a source of existential release and relief. And if we're lucky enough, the actual liberation itself from fear and duality. So some of us have mild experiences of just kind of penetration into the non-duality. Some people have very little brief glimpses of non-duality, and some people have very deep and profound and transformative experiences of non-duality. Some people recover from these experiences and are able to move on relatively unaffected by them. And some other people are so deeply affected by these kinds of experiences that they find themselves irrevocably transformed by them. In other words, for some of us, the impression of the awakening to our non-duality makes upon our nervous systems and our minds and our very souls. It creates such an impression that it reconfigures the way we think about everything. And if it's deep enough, it becomes our fundamental reference points in relationship to the totality of the human experience. So simply put, the solution to conflict is enlightenment. What a novel idea. But it's always been true, and it continues to be true today. So the awakening to non-duality, or awakening to enlightened awareness, can solve the issue of conflict for the unique individual, him or herself, within him or herself. And it can, and it will always do that. But once we've solved this question of non-duality, and once we have access to non-dual states of consciousness, and this connection is so deep that we have become irrevocably transformed as a result, we might have come to the end of conflict, or any fundamental conflict within ourselves personally. But if we end the conflict within ourselves, it doesn't mean we come to the end of conflict in the world or in relationship to the world. And this is one of the huge challenges of living a spiritual life in earnest, is this deep embracing, the actual embracing of the significance of non-duality that embraces both inner reality and outer reality, or heaven and earth. Because ultimately everything is one. But we find that the inner revelation of oneness and non-duality does not solve the question of conflict in terms of our relationship with the outside world. So the way I've helped myself solve this problem, and the way I've encouraged all my students to solve this problem, is I've always said that we want to seek for the ultimate truth. I've always felt that if there is such a thing as ultimate truth, which there is, But I try to be very easy about it. So if there is an ultimate truth, I would certainly want to know what it is, or we would certainly want to know what it is, because if there's an ultimate truth, we'd want to know it, not for its own sake necessarily, but because if there's an ultimate truth, it would be important to know what that was before we were able to decide what we want to do here on earth and how we want to do it, right? If you want to try and figure out what you're going to do here and how you're going to do it without knowing what the ultimate truth is, it's going to be a mess. And for a lot of people, it is a mess. So first we want to solve this problem and try to find out what the Buddha was, try to discover what the Buddha was talking about from our own direct experience. But once we find out that the Buddha was actually speaking, when he was speaking about enlightenment, he was speaking about something that's actually available to all of us, if we're willing to dig deep enough within our own consciousness. Once we find it, if we're that lucky. But if we're not lucky enough to experientially discover directly what the Buddha was speaking about for ourselves, as an inner reality, as an inner knowing, as an inner spiritual self-confidence, then the question becomes, well, how do I bridge the gap between this inner knowledge, this inner non-dual state of consciousness, and the reality and complexity of the world of form and matter and mind and consciousness and culture and human relatedness and relationship and so many choices that need to be made? How does the inner experience of non-duality or oneness affect our relationship with the world all around us? And that becomes a very complex question. So what I've always done myself, and what I've always encouraged my students to do, is to first seek to become grounded in this non-dual awakening, this non-dual recognition. Grounded means one has realized a profound degree of confidence. But to use mythic language, that God exists, that this non-dual, absolute, non-relative dimension of reality exists, is real, is tangible, is experientiable, is knowable, is available, and then ask ourselves, what kind of relationship to life would be most conducive to me being able to sustain access to this higher state of non-dual awareness? Obviously, certain actions would make it easier to sustain access to a higher state of consciousness, and other actions and other choices would make it more difficult. And in traditional societies, in traditional cultural context, there's been the distinction between living a spiritual life and a worldly life. The spiritual life was considered to be a life where one was focused solely on spiritual concerns, and the worldly life was where one was focused more on survival and material matters and procreation and things like that. And to live the religious life, one was often compelled to leave the world behind and go to live in the monastery or on the mountaintop or in the forest or the woods, to get away from the world of material and familial complexity, so one could focus fully and dwell on this non-dual interior dimension of this soul of reality. And there's truth in this approach, this perspective, but as we've taken the journey from the traditional context to the modern one, to the postmodern context, a lot of very, very sophisticated postmodern realizers have embraced a more sophisticated interpretive framework of the nature of non-duality, and are saying that non-duality, embracing non-duality, or embracing the fact that there's some totality of reality exists as a fundamental truth, as a fundamental dimension of reality at all places and all times, no matter where one is, whether one is in the world or whether one is sitting on a mountaintop. non-dual oneness or the absolute dimension of reality exists all in all places at the same time. So especially at this particular time in history, when we think about non-duality, it doesn't necessarily mean living in a cabin in the woods or versus living in the city or living anywhere else. It has to do with a fundamental relationship to the totality of life itself, and to all the complexity of the choices that we need to make in order to live a meaningful and purposeful life. So that's why I've always been encouraging everybody to really consider deeply what are those kinds of life choices that I could make that would enhance and protect my access to non-duality, and what are those choices that I would make that would make my access to non-duality much more difficult and make it more difficult for me to remain connected. Because remember, the awakening to non-duality, and I'm using the word non-duality here as a metaphor for the end of conflict, is the same thing. Remember this, the awakened state is very subtle. When you're in that state, its beauty and its non-relative nature seems obvious and apparent. And indestructible. But when you have experience with these higher states of consciousness, after a while you begin to notice that as obvious and profound as life transforming as they are, they can be easily lost and forgotten when the worldly context changes, when life distracts us with unforeseen events, familial obligations, work obligations, all kinds of unexpected things happening. We can often forget or lose touch or lose track of the deeper interior dimension of reality, which alone sets us free. And it's one of the strange things about non-duality as a state experience. It's so easy to awaken to it, and so easy to forget it and fall out of it once again. So this is why I think a big part of spiritual practice, and what I very much encourage people to do all the time, is to think deeply about the choices that we're making in relationship to the life we're living and how we're living it. And if we're committed to the awakened life, then we would want to make a commitment to always putting having access to this higher state of consciousness as a experiential necessity, as an experiential priority. Which means we wouldn't want to do anything or make any kind of choices which would make it more difficult to gain access to it. And in that way, our life and the way it's lived begins to create itself. That's how a spiritual life well lived creates itself or gives rise to itself in the complexity of the modern and postmodern cultural landscape. So I've been on this path for a good 40 years by now, which is a little bit of time. 40 years, I'm 67, so 68, I just turned 68. And I've been pretty consistent in putting spirit first. Now remember, in the context of this particular conversation we're having, this I am equating non-duality and the end of conflict as being the same thing. And I'm finding, to my surprise, at the age of 68, I find myself living in paradise. And this paradise didn't just appear, because I made very important choices that would make paradise more likely. But there's a strange, mysterious, metaphysical sense that when you put spirit first, or the end of conflict first, and you do it with all of your heart, and you're willing to take enormous risks to do it, which means to hell with what anybody else thinks. I'm living for spirit first, no matter what anybody thinks about me. There's a strange sense of destiny begins to be felt that one begins to feel, and I've been certainly feeling the presence of mysterious, unimaginably positive karmic forces at work. I hope I'm not going out on a limb here, but I'm speaking freely. That if we put coming to the end of conflict, which means giving this access to non-dual consciousness, which remember is the access to the very ground of the totality of reality. It's the conscious cognizance of non-relative or absolute dimension of reality. It's putting that first. It's saying that contact with this non-relative or absolute dimension of reality keeps me in touch with the biggest truth that there is. And as long as I'm in touch with the biggest truth that there is, the life choices I'm going to make will put that first. But if I'm out of touch with it, I'm liable to forget what's most important. I might slip back unknowingly into a relative relationship to relative reality and forgot what it was like to live in heaven. So, regarding the end of conflict, what I wanted to say was that not before we awaken, but after we awaken, once we're grounded in the awakened state of consciousness, we find that we mysteriously, miraculously, in a mind transcending way, begin to crave connections or relationships with other human beings who are as interested in non-duality as we are. Because what we crave after we awaken, what we crave more than anything else, is to stand in the reflection of this metaphysical absolute dimension of reality. We crave to stand in its reflection, and we experience that reflection in the hearts and minds and bodies of other human beings who are also awake to this non-dual dimension of reality, because they see what we see and they know what we know, and then we're able to meet in this higher dimension of truth. We're able to meet there without any effort. It's spontaneous and natural and easy, and suddenly it becomes possible to utterly relax existentially in our humanity. It's when we can enter what's called the natural state together. And after you awaken, you crave the company of others with whom you can relax in this way in yourself, and they can relax this natural state in themselves, and then together we begin to give rise to a metaphysically miraculous and intersubjective or cultural context where the presence of this non-duality or oneness is felt by one and all, and it becomes the very ground upon which we meet, and it becomes the ground upon which our relationships are based. So if the inherent oneness or non-dual truth becomes the ground upon which our relationships are based, we begin meeting in another dimension that transcends time itself. And that makes the human experience so much more interesting and so much more deep and profound, meaningful and purposeful, and rich with spirit. And once you have that kind of experience, no other more kind of mundane or ordinary kinds of human relationships can get near it, can touch it. Now, one of the signs of meeting another in this non-dual ground is that the fundamental feeling of distance or separation or division, which is experienced as mistrust between you and the other, disappears. And suddenly you find that there's at a level of metaphysical feeling, you feel that there's no distance, there's no gap, there's no distance, there's no doubt, there's no suspicion of the other human being anymore. You're just simply together in sharing a very deep trust in the ultimate nature of reality. And this means the end of conflict. It means that fundamentally you come to the end of conflict. You come to the end of human conflict. And the spiritual life, when it's lived in the context of the awakening to enlightened awareness, is a life that's lived fundamentally free from conflict. If it's the real deal, if it's the real deal and people are really awake and they're really paying the price of ego transcendence and mind transcendence, then it's going to look very good. It's going to look peaceful, and it's going to look like there's enormous freedom that comes when human beings trust each other. And it's a place where the ego starts feeling irrelevant. I'm not needed here. There's nothing for me to do. I have no role to play in this context where there's so much trust and naturalness, unself-conscious naturalness. So the awakening to enlightened awareness in earnest, awakened to in the context of the practice of ego transcendence, which takes a little effort now and then, makes it possible for human beings to experience at a level of intersubjectivity or a shared cultural context. Freedom from conflict, freedom from division, freedom from duality, freedom from suspicion, freedom from fear, freedom from rage and anger, freedom from mental illness, freedom from resentment, freedom from suspicion and doubt. Everything that makes human experience so painful and so wretched can be transcended in a real and tangible way. And then it becomes delightful to be a human being, living and being together in the context with other human beings. And life becomes so joyful and so free from conflict, free from conflict, free from conflict. So I think generally speaking, the way to come to the end of conflict is we have to start with coming to the end of conflict within ourselves personally, which is a big deal, which is practicing the path of enlightenment and pursuing it in earnest till we make the enormous breakthrough that changes everything. And once we've done that, then we want to sit down and figure out, well, what kind of relationship to life makes the most sense now that I'm enlightened. If I should be so lucky. And then in a larger sense, we have to start thinking about what our values are. What are our values? Because to speak about this a little differently, non-duality, the living and the embracing of non-duality is not so difficult when there's just you and your friend. But there's a way to think about non-duality in the context of the way we think, the practice of cognition. Because the test of our capacity to embrace non-duality means how profound is our ability to embrace complexity without losing access to the non-dual ground that we have realized. As the great Ken Wilber once said, most human beings can't assume more than one perspective at a time. And as we awaken, as we awaken to not only consciousness itself, but complex consciousness and complex cognition, we begin to realize, as Ken Wilber pointed out to all of us, that a big part of the human experience, especially at higher levels of consciousness development, is our ability to take multiple perspectives, which means a very sophisticated, cultured, educated, informed human being is able to see any given issue or any given truth from multiple vantage points. And integral philosophy would tell us that the more vantage points we can see any particular issue from, the more wisdom we're going to have, the wider and deeper will be our embrace of the human experience, inner and outer. So another question here in terms of coming to the end of conflict comes up at higher levels of development when we ask the question is how much is if indeed we are grounded in a non-dual state, which most people are not. But if we just assume that we are for the sake of the discussion, how profound is our capacity to embrace multiple perspectives? How much complexity can we include in our capacity to see and understand any issue or any situation without losing access to the fundamental truth about the non-dual ground of the totality of reality itself? Because simplicity makes oneness more apparent, and complexity in an uninvolved mind would seem to obscure it. But if our mind has evolved, as our soul has awakened to the enlightened state, then the recognition of multidimensional complexity would not obscure the non-dual context of all human experience. And obviously, if we look around at a lot of the conflict in the world today, and the conflict has been part and parcel of the human experience since the beginning of time, it's usually because we refuse to embrace more complexity. Kind of like, I'm right and you're wrong. I'm right and you're wrong. We're right and you all are wrong. And since we disagree, let's fight about it. So if we can evolve to the point where we're able to be aware of the multidimensional complexity that's part and parcel of the totality of reality in all its many dimensions, without losing touch with the non-dual ground itself, conflict would be much more unlikely to happen. Because no matter how much complexity we would be seeing, knowing, understanding, and grappling with, we would never lose touch with the fact that we are not separate. That this is one process that's occurring here between all of us. And that's the deepest dimension of the truth that we're experiencing at all times, in all places, through all circumstances. But it's the minute that we forget that we're all having the same experience, and we're all in this together, that division and mistrust and hatred from many different levels of human development begins to come to the surface, and we can get drowned in it. We can drown in it. There's so many people drowning in it today. So being able to awaken to non-duality in the context of absolute simplicity is one thing. It's where we want to start. But when we can do that, we then want to see, can we stay grounded in this absolute non-dual being or knowing in the context of seeing and embracing greater and greater levels of complexity. And as the human experience becomes more complex, as it is, in so many levels, for us to be able to consistently be able to see our way forward without losing our way or losing our minds and hearts and souls, we're going to have to learn how to be able to not only awaken to non-duality, but cultivate the capacity to embrace complexity without losing the plot. The more I can see about myself, and the more I can see about you, the more you can see about yourself, and the more you can see about me, will make it possible for us to come together and not separate. One thing that I used to emphasize a great deal with my students was to cultivate the spiritual capacity to make the effort not to separate, even in the face of conflict, even in the face of fear, even in the face of doubt, even in the face of confusion. No, don't pull away, don't step back, don't step out of the ring. Because if we can stay, if we have the spiritual strength and the moral courage and the spiritual conviction to stay in the ring without without moving, without backing out of it. In the face of so much conflict, there's a very good chance we can move through it together and we come to a higher level of integration and oneness. But usually when things get a little bit rocky emotionally, psychologically, philosophically, metaphysically, in so many other ways, we immediately separate, we pull back and step away from the other or the others. And once we step back and step away, the possibility for meeting each other at a higher level, which we can transcend and include all the confusion, has been lost. And the human inclination, just to repeat what I'm saying, the human inclination when we're challenged is to step out and step away instead of staying grounded and focused and steady. Which means bearing the insecurity and embracing more of the complexity that's there, without losing our access to the non-dual ground and to our fundamental trust in reality itself. It's a big existential challenge. Because the seeds of conflict is when we see the other as other. The minute we do that, conflict is inevitable. And what I'm advocating is difficult. It's not easy. Very challenging even for smart people. What I'm advocating here has less to do with how intelligent. If you can being able to pull off what I'm advocating here has less to do with how intelligent you are and more to do with how spiritually developed one actually is. And finally, once we, on our own personal spiritual journey, once we awaken to non-duality or this absolute dimension of reality, realize this non-dual oneness, if it's for real, and in many of the great realizers throughout history, it's been for real. We look at their lives, we'll notice that, excuse me, more often than not, those people who have been deeply touched by spirit and are grounded in this kind of awakening aspire to include as many other souls in that awakening as possible, because the mystery of non-duality, the mystery of oneness, the mystery of spirit, we discover when we awaken deeply enough, has its own agenda, and part of its own agenda is to include all sentient beings in its self-reflective knowing. So as much as we think we're looking for spirit, spirit's looking for us all the time, waiting for us to be available for it. So in the awakened hearts and minds, and the awakened souls of the realizers, there's always been this heartfelt aspiration to enlighten the universe. Enlighten the whole universe. What a crazy aspiration. But enlightenment makes people crazy too, because we start thinking so big. What an audacious thought to enlighten the whole universe. But it comes from the consciousness itself. It doesn't come from the human mind itself. Inherent in the consciousness of non-duality is this mysterious love aspiration to include the whole universe in this awakening to non-dual truth, to the miracle of oneness, the miracle of the truth that everything that exists truly depends upon everything else that exists, and that there's no way out of this. And in the end, when we wake up, we feel that's the only way forward is to embrace all of it, fully, unconditionally, radically, and absolutely. And that's the way to become unconditionally free. But just to remember that this this coming to the end of conflict, which we all think we want, is already inherent in Spirit's own agenda. If you can believe what I'm saying, that Spirit has its own agenda one finds when one awakens. That there is inherent agenda in, in the consciousness of Spirit itself. So you could say this is what Spirit wants, this is what the God principle wants. It sounds far-fetched, but it happens to be true. How do I know? Well, that's because I feel it. It doesn't mean it's absolutely true, but it feels like it's absolutely true. And anybody who's been touched deeply enough by awakened Spirit feels the same way. They feel choicelessly with so much inspiration that everybody should be so free and everybody should be so happy and everybody should be a conscious participant in the miracle of the possible. Because there's nothing better to do than this. That's how it seems anyway. Very good. Thank you, everybody. I did my best. I hope you find that helpful. And that's why for all of us, this crazy, because there's so much, all this conflict that we're bearing witness to is so painful, because it's the last thing all of us want. It's the last thing we want.
If you have any questions, please write them in the chat box. And I don't have a question yet, but I have a comment from Sahaja, who is saying, your talk was too brilliant to have any questions left.
Well, Sahaja, you know, you can answer, you can turn on your mic if you want.
Yeah, wait, Sahaja, I have to turn it on. Oops, here we go.
So Sahaja, you know, you've heard of the questionless state?
I've heard which question you mean?
Have you heard of the questionless state?
No.
So there's a state of consciousness in which one is so touched by the presence of this non-dual truth that one's mind stops. And then one feels oneself simply filled up with the presence of Spirit, and all of one's apparently important questions dissolve into nothingness. And one is then literally just spontaneously, naturally, effortlessly abiding in the answer, that in the mind transcending answer that is a state of consciousness and not a question. It's called the questionless state, which actually has greater depth than even the most sophisticated questions. Because the questionless state is the answer to all the questions in the end.
I think I've experienced the questionless state many times, but I didn't know that this was kind of, you know, even an official state, if you want so.
Absolutely, very official. Yes, when the mind and ego become struck dumb. It's when they're rendered irrelevant and unnecessary. Mm-hmm. And then one can just be without them. Just fine, thank you.
So thank you for your incredible presence and transmission that leaves me in this questionless state.
Well, that's very sweet. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Andrew. There is a question from Rita. I will open your microphone, Rita. She says, that was incredibly helpful. Thank you. I'm just now coming to the other side of my dark night of the soul, and I still have flare-ups of anxiety. I am aware this energy is present, and I am learning how to use it for my own transformation. My mind cannot make sense of it. This causes only more anxiety. Is there something specific I can do when these moments happen? What causes this internal conflict for my being?
Can you read it again, please?
That was incredibly helpful. Thank you. I'm just now coming to the other side of my dark night of the soul, and I still have flare-ups of anxiety. I am aware this energy is present, and I am learning how to use it for my own transformation. My mind cannot make sense of it. This causes only more anxiety. Is there something specific I can do when these moments happen? What causes this internal conflict for my being?
Well, very good. So I don't know what's causing you to have these uncomfortable moments, but we all have them. It's part and parcel of the human experience. Is once in a while to experience emotional or existential discomfort for one reason or another, and sometimes it's important that we understand what's causing the discomfort, and other times it doesn't make any difference. But the most important thing is to in moments like that is to try and assume no relationship to the anxiety. Because sometimes if we experience anxiety and we focus on the anxiety gets worse. Then it becomes a problem that we feel we have to get rid of. And if we can't get rid of the problem, which is the presence of uncomfortable feelings, we feel we're going to die. I'm exaggerating for drama, but I'm just making a point. So one of the reasons that the practice of meditation is so important as we embrace the spiritual life in earnest is the meditative process gives us an opportunity to practice having no relationship with the content of consciousness, which means thoughts and feelings. Because in our unconscious, unenlightened, ordinary state of consciousness, we are constantly reacting to unwanted thoughts and unpleasant and painful feelings. And this is causing us to experience all kinds of emotional ups and downs that often have nothing to do with the actual circumstances of our present body, mind, personality experience. So in the meditative process, we learn to just have no relationship to any thoughts or any feelings, no high or low. We learn how to assume the position of no relationship. Now, relationship always means two. There always has to be two to be in a relationship. No relationship means one or zero. No relationship means one or zero. The sum totality of all of reality is either called one or oneness, or everything is one is everything, or the sum totality of reality is also called nothingness. So the sum totality of reality is either called oneness, and the flip side of oneness is emptiness or nothingness. So when we assume no relationship to the content of consciousness, it gives us easy access to the ultimate nature of reality, which is oneness or emptiness or nothingness. If we choose a relationship to the content of consciousness, it's usually going to cause, especially if it's difficult feelings and thoughts, it's going to cause more pain and more suffering. So the assuming this, learning how to assume no relationship to the content of consciousness as a practice, what do we learn how to do? Gives us more easy access to the ultimate nature of reality, which is oneness or emptiness or nothingness. And if you learn how to become grounded in enlightened awareness, and then begin to practice the meditative process from the perspective of the state of enlightened awareness, you're able to experience all kinds of thoughts and all kinds of feelings without being touched by them, without being so easily moved by them. You're able to see them as simply mind stuff. But you can for periods of time not be so hurt by them and not be so disturbed by them. One cultivates and gains the ability to let it all go, no matter what it is, just to let it all go, no matter what it is, to let it all go, no matter what it is, to let it all go, until there's nothing left except oneness or emptiness or nothingness. and oneness always feels free. It's freedom, freedom from the mind, freedom from memory, freedom from time, freedom from fear, freedom from anxiety, freedom from past and future, freedom from all our egoic concerns and being trapped in history and time and karma. It's we're always wound up and being trapped and tied up in knots in relationship to history, time, and karma. When we awaken to oneness or emptiness or nothingness, that all dissolves and disappears like a mist. So we want to learn. We want to become good yogis, which means we want to learn good practitioners. So we become experts at letting go of the conditioned mind and our conditioned emotional karmic stream. And we can learn to become experts. We can learn to become very good at it. But we have to work at it every day, a little bit every day, a little bit every day. And then we become less concerned with the content of consciousness, and more become interested in experiencing the nature of consciousness. So in other words, the content in the context of your question was whatever it was, whatever was disturbing you, whatever issues are disturbing you. And from a psychological orientation or perspective, we feel, well, if something's bothering me, then I have to figure out what it is and then deconstruct it psychologically, and then it won't bother me anymore. But when we approach it from what I call a spiritual perspective or an enlightenment perspective, we don't need to deconstruct anything. We just transcend. We just want to unlock the knots that are tying us to these beliefs. So we're not trying to work it out anymore. We just work on letting it all go. We're not trying to work it out anymore. We're just trying to let it all go. We're not trying to work it out anymore. We're just trying to let it all go. And letting go always brings us immediately spiritual release and relief. And we experience the release and relief not because we've understood something that was troubling us, but just because we let it go without even needing to understand it. Because when it's gone, baby, it's gone. It really doesn't matter anymore. But when we're so attached to the problem, it really feels like it's so important that we've got to figure it out. We have to come to terms with it. We've got to unravel it. But when we let go of it, suddenly we realize it doesn't matter. Number one, and at a deeper level, we realize it never mattered. And when we realize it never mattered, that's when we experience spiritual freedom, or inner freedom, or the freedom of enlightened awareness. And that comes, and ecstasy comes with that. It's untying the whole knot of ignorance and the bondage that the ego creates for all of us. So the idea with enlightenment is we want to let go of the whole thing. We don't want to work it out. We want to let go of the whole thing. We don't want to work it out. We want to let go of the whole thing. We don't need to work it out. We want to let go of the whole thing if we can. That's the aspiration. So my answer to you is begin to spend some time, if you can, every day, sitting quietly and making the noble effort to let go of your own mind. For 10 minutes, 20 minutes, up to an hour or two. Just sitting quietly and letting go of your mind. Experiencing the inherent fullness of which is the nature of your own consciousness already. And when you get the hang of it, when you learn how to do it, you start experiencing an inner momentum that feels like freedom. It feels so good. It feels better than working everything out or working anything out. It just feels free already. Does that help?
You described it exactly. Thank you.
And you know why? You know how I did that?
No, but it was brilliant. Thank you.
But I want to tell you how I did it, because we're all having the same experience. I'm having the same experience you are.
And that is so deeply comforting to know that I'm not alone.
Exactly. We're all having the human experience. And a lot of it sucks.
It sure does. Thank you.
Okay.
I knew the next question comes from Morgan. I open his microphone. He had difficulty to write, so he will tell you his question. Sorry, Morgan, you have to click again.
There
Yeah.
we go.
Yeah, here we go.
Sorry, Andrew. Typing is a problem because my computer is messing up. So every time I try to type a message, it's typing triple letters, and I said I might as well just ask you. But
Morgan, you know what? I don't know if you know, but I have Parkinson's disease, and so I get that effect anyway.
That's funny.
It is. It's a pain in the ass, but it's funny. Yes.
My question to you is something that you said earlier. You said that there are some people who have the non-dual experience but are unaffected by it.
Well, I don't think I said exactly that.
Okay, wasn't okay. I'm hoping that it wasn't that. Well, only because I had problems with agreeing with that in the sense because I've met people who've claimed to have the non-dual experience, but I don't see any change. I don't see any transformation. There's transformation in regards to their development has changed where they're doing better things in the community, but there is no sense of them having the comprehension of the self, anything that's non-dual or anything of that sort, and even still ask questions in regards to the ultimate self, and they have a hard time accepting that as a reality. So I always question that if they actually had a non-dual experience, or they probably had a spiritual experience or a peak experience, but not a non-dual experience of suchness. What do you say
Well,
to that?
maybe they had a glimpse of non-duality, but they're certainly not grounded in it.
So that could happen. So you can have a glimpse, not be grounded in it, and you just go right back to who you
Being a jerk.
or being a jerk. I see.
Yeah,
Understand. Okay.
because because I remember when I asked my guru, I said, does the ego really die with enlightenment? He said no. He said, Andrew, the ego becomes sattvic, which means peaceful. So one of the signs of a deep awakening is that there's a feeling of that the ego in the awakened individual has been tamed. Doesn't mean it's gone or absent, but it's fundamentally been tamed.
Mm-hmm.
And what that looks like and feels like is people in that's whose egos have been tamed, transmit a kind of natural sweetness and softness in their personality. But if you feel the hardness in someone's frontal personality, where you can tell they're still operating in a way that's less than convincing in terms of the awakening,
Mm-hmm.
it's probably true because enlightenment looks like it looks like something and feels like something. If you have the eyes to recognize it, it has a very particular radiance. And if someone is truly grounded in enlightened awareness, then it's going to be pretty obvious after a while to a lot of people, because you can't fake it.
Mm-hmm.
And also, Morgan, even more importantly, experiences come and go. But being grounded in the unshakable conviction of the reality of enlightenment itself, and having no doubt about it, something else very different that's not dependent upon the highs and lows of particular states of consciousness. If one has unconditionally surrendered to use mythic language, to God, if one at the level of the soul is on one's knees before the metaphysical absolute, and that changes us fundamentally forever if it's real. It means our ego has been tamed. Doesn't mean it's permanently always trustworthy from then on in, but it means its back has been broken in a fundamental way.
Mm-hmm.
And it's no longer dangerous. So it means we're no longer going to sabotage our own life or anybody else's. And it also means we're fundamentally trustworthy on a human level, deeply. Some people are actually deeply trustworthy. A lot of people aren't. So becoming somebody who's deeply trustworthy comes from this capacity, is the result of surrendering so deeply and becoming an authentic person, authentic realizer, an authentically surrendered soul before a metaphysical absolute principle. And if it's real, I'm saying it can't be faked.
Can't be faked.
if it's real. Because if it's not steady or stable, if you get to know somebody over time, you start to see cracks. Because one of the signs of being grounded in enlightened awareness is consistency. And also, Morgan, remember that all kinds of people are attracted to higher states of consciousness.
Say that part again.
All kinds of people are attracted to higher states of consciousness for all kinds of reasons. So people who are audacious enough to publicly declare their own illumination attract all kinds of crazy people. This goes with the territory. It's part of the territory.
Makes
and
sense.
also beautiful, sensitive, intelligent people also. But it's a unique category of human experience that attracts all different kinds of people at all different levels of development for all kinds of different reasons.
Even at the lowest level of psychological development?
Well, I'm not sure what you mean by the lowest level, but it sounds pretty low. All I'm saying is it's a jungle out there.
That makes sense. That makes sense. So then what about just say if a individual does have those things, but it's still not an indication of non-dual suchness, I guess. There's people who are, they're nice people. They're able to help out others in time of need. So they may have high levels of emotional intelligence and things of that sort. But those are not necessarily a result of the experience of non-dual suchness per se. But I guess if you have the non-dual suchness that comes with that.
Well, that's what we would hope for. But you can be a great person without having access to enlightened awareness.
Mm-hmm.
A lot of beautiful people don't have access to enlightened awareness, and as you yourself pointed out, there are some unsavory people that seem to have access to enlightened awareness also. How's that for complexity?
Very complex.
Ken Wilber often speaks about this book, Zen and War, which tells the story of that apparently during World War II, all of the most revered Zen masters in Japanese Zen, who had been recognized with their own tradition to have attained the highest levels of enlightened awareness, all without exception were supporters of the emperor's totalitarian aspirations in the Pacific. So their enlightenment hadn't enabled them to transcend their fascist and ethnocentric inclinations.
Mm-hmm.
How's that for a confusing picture? How's that for a confusing picture?
See, very, very, when people hear that story, I remember him telling that story. When people hear that story, they question it. They say, how can that be possible? How can a person have the highest level of enlightenment yet still be trapped in their ethnocentric ways of being? But that's very complex. I don't know.
Well, it just means that there's difference between an integral philosophy. There's difference between the attainment of states of consciousness and stages of consciousness.
Stages of consciousness, yeah.
In the integral lens, it would mean that they have realized a very high state of consciousness, but they're still at the mythic level of stage development, and they're not able, therefore, to see beyond it.
Yes, makes sense. Thank you, Andrew.
Yeah, and 1 second, just so Morgan, on this topic, it gets very subtle because it's also possible for people to be very intellectually sophisticated and intellectually informed about all these matters and still have no access to the thing itself. So if you're very intellectually informed and very intellectually developed, you can seem like you're more enlightened than you really are. It's very important to be able to make these kinds of distinctions. So we want to be very, we want to cultivate our sincere spiritual aspiration to awaken to enlightened awareness on the level of the Buddha, if such a thing could be possible, on one hand.
Mhm.
And at the same time, we want to be very skeptical about this. At the same time, we want to be very skeptical and hold a lot of caution in our minds about ourselves and each other, just so we don't overestimate or underestimate ourselves or anybody else. And this just requires time and experience to learn how to do this. Thank you, Martin. Thank you.
Thank you.
The next question, Andrew, is from Max. He is asking, conflict is the moving force of evolution. New cannot beat the old without conflict. Does the end of conflict mean a shift from seeker to finder in one sense? What will or could move me then?
Can you read Max's question again?
Yeah. Conflict is the moving force of evolution.
So one second. So Max, the first thing is that if we embrace enlightenment in an evolutionary context, we realize there's positive conflict and negative conflict. So positive conflict is, I call it creative friction. And so there's positive creative friction, and negative friction is destructive. Positive friction is creative. So friction could be the universe was created in an explosion, right? The material universe was created in an explosion, and we know that many stars had to crash into each other and explode to create the conditions that made it possible for more complex compounds to emerge. It created the conditions that made it possible for life to emerge. That would be creative conflict, creative friction. And negative friction is when it's just purely destructive, is when it destroys beautiful things. It destroys very positive structures. So we want to see that reality is difficult and confusing, but there's creative friction and negative friction. So like what's happening in Ukraine right now is negative friction, very destructive. But creative friction is how we make babies. We create creative friction. We make babies at a biological level, and if we were in ancient Greece at the time of Socrates, for example, and Plato, that was intellectual creative friction, and that kind of creative friction gave rise to new ideas and new possibilities, new possibilities. And when smart creative people interact with other smart creative people in a context of trust and mutual aspiration, those kind of relationships can give rise to new ideas and new possibilities, new potentials. It could never have emerged just from one mind. So all kinds of beautiful things can happen with positive friction, creative friction. Negative friction always destroys and is very, very negative and dark. So what was the next part of the question?
The next part is, does the end of conflict mean shift from seeker to finder in one sense? What will or could move me then?
Well, the end of conflict could mean that you come to the end of seeking. Usually when one comes to the end of seeking, one comes to the end of the belief that there's something fundamentally wrong, right? One comes to the end of seeking when you realize everything is as it should be. What was the last part of the question?
What would move me then? What?
Oh, right, yeah. So this is what I wanted to speak about in my next talk, Max. But the end of seeking is not the end of evolution. Evolution for a human being means the possibility of perpetual development. perpetual, eternal development. So just because we've had an awakening to the absolute that's deep and permanent, then seeking comes to an end because we found what we're looking for. God has found us, so now we're not seeking anymore because we've been found. We found her and she's found us. So seeking comes to an end because we found what we're looking for. But the end of seeking is not the end of becoming. Becoming is an eternal aspiration and an eternal process. So what should move you in the context of this teaching, once you've come to the end of seeking, is the eternal potential of is cultivating your own eternal evolutionary potential. Is that clear? Did you say something?
Yes, I said yes.
Okay, very good.
And then in the beginning of the talk, you said that the suffering was a moving force.
I'm sorry?
You realize that the suffering was a moving force for the realizers. And I got it like a conflict. The suffering is an inner conflict.
Yeah, I'm sorry, I can't quite remember what I said, so I can't find having trouble following the question.
Andrew, I think you said that sometimes suffering is catalyzing awakening.
Oh yes. Oh yes. Yes, that's right. That's right. I'm
Yeah.
sorry. So what did you say, Max, again? I'm sorry.
Yeah, I got this statement as a suffering, like a inner conflict.
Yes, sure. Sure, yeah, and often suffering can compel somebody to make the heroic effort to break out of it, to transcend it, to overcome it. No. So suffering can be a great catalyst for change. They have what's called, Max, breakthrough or breakdown. Suffering can either enable us to break through or to break down. And sometimes suffering compels some people to break through, have a higher breakthrough, and some people to break down and fall apart.
So the same suffering for some of people, it's a creative, positive friction, and for some, it's like the real end.
Yeah, there's a documentary on Netflix, Max, about Arnold Schwarzenegger. You know who Arnold Schwarzenegger is?
Yeah.
So Arnold Schwarzenegger, who grew up in Vienna, I think, he said his father was very mean, and his father used to beat him very much and beat his brother. So Arnold had a younger brother. So Arnold said he was very strong. So he said his father's cruelty and compelled him to become a stronger man, because he knew to survive he was going to have to be very strong to overcome his father's cruelty. But his brother, who was much weaker, was very sensitive, was destroyed and broken by it, and eventually committed suicide. Interesting. Yeah.
The next question is from Igor. What is precondition for non-dual interaction, and how spirit manifests in general? How to notice it?
So Igor, are those two questions or one question?
You know better.
No, but you have to have compassion for me because I have to answer the question. So it sounds like two different questions.
Yes. So the first question about the precondition.
The precondition is the longing, or the desire has to be there. The longing and the spiritual desire. The liberation has to be there. The desire for liberation, the longing for liberation, the desire for liberation is the precondition. And The willingness to let go unconditionally is a precondition. The willingness to let go unconditionally is a precondition. And the capacity, the profound spiritual capacity to trust beyond the mind is a precondition. The profound spiritual capacity to trust beyond the mind is a really big deal. It's a very big deal. So once again, the most profound precondition is the willingness and the ability to trust beyond the mind. Because the mind, the mind connected to the unenlightened ego always thinks it knows better. Always. So for someone who wants to break through to enlightened awareness, one has to be able to see through the mind and beyond the mind. Trusting beyond the mind. Trusting beyond the mind's interpretive habits. Always trusting beyond them, knowing how to trust beyond them. Having the spiritual courage and aspiration to trust beyond them. So the preconditions for the enlightened intersubjective non-duality would all be the same, what I just said. Strong longing for non-dual love. It's a strong longing. Which is sincerity, and the capacity to see and feel beyond the mind.
And what about intention? Because is it needed part also? Intention on
always
particular subject.
Always needed. Always needed. Because the question, who's driving the car, right? Who's in the front seat behind the driver's wheel, behind the steering wheel? Who's driving the car? It's this intention. So where does the intention come from? Well, as you may or may not know, the ego in this teaching, we make a distinction between positive ego and negative ego. So the positive ego, the healthy ego, has a very different intention than the negative ego and then self-destructive ego. The true self has a different intention than the authentic self. They all have different intentions.
Do I understand correct that intention is not about just like something to be free? It is something specific intention to do something, like ask specific question on specific topic.
No, it means it's a focused aspiration. What are you aspiring to do? What are you aspiring to reach? What's your goal? I intend to become enlightened sooner rather than later.
Is non-subjective communication happens on material plan or also mental plan and energy plan?
Okay, this is the last question. Igor, say that again, sorry.
The question about non-subjective communication, is it happens only through words or actions, or it can happen through energy and through thoughts?
I'm sorry, I can't understand. I can't understand the English.
Mm-hmm.
But you know what, Igor, I think I gave you some great answer to the first question.
I agree with it, yes.
What?
Totally agree.
So, because what happens when we receive a good answer, if the answer is good, it should quiet our mind. In the practice of the inquiry in this context should settle the mind and quiet it, not agitate it. Where are you now, Igor? Where are you?
I'm in Russia, in Arkhangelsk. Celebrate beautiful day.
So you're back in Russia.
Yes. I will move in some months to the west, to the east.
And you come back to the east.
Yes, I am, and also my plan is to go to India this year too. I hope it will be.
What a wonderful idea.
Yes, wonderful and long time wished.
Very good. So don't get stuck in Bali this time.
All will be amazing, I'm sure.
Okay, very good. Thank you, Igor.
Andrew,
Thank
this
you for
was the last, this was
I'm
the last
sorry.
question, Andrew.
Okay, very good. Oh, that was the last one?
Yes.
Very good. Anything else before we finish, everybody?